This Future Proofing Your Land Forum is the first of a series of events that Geelong Landcare Network are planning to run under the banner of Farming for Our Future. Landcare has always been about looking after the ecology, planting trees, protecting remnants and fencing off waterways. In this program, we're going a little further down and looking into how and why we should enhance ecology in our production systems to regenerate soils in our landscapes. The first event, we look at the principles of ecological production and how this type of system might fit into your operation, as well as the economics of doing so. So without too much further ado, I'd like to just acknowledge that our guest speaker today is Dr Wendy Seabrook, and she's the author of this fine publication here that I picked up, and I knew nothing about Wendy before I bought this, and I think that this handbook is one of the best resources that there is around for people who are new to the area of ecological agriculture. Some might call it regenerative agriculture. So it's a great book and it's well worth picking up. All right, so Dr Wendy Seabrook is the founder and director of Learning from Nature, author of the Ecological Farming Handbook and the Ecological Gardening Handbook, and manager of Hilltop Farm, the demonstration site and education centre for learning from nature. Over the last 20 years, Dr Seabrook has partnered with organisations like the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds in the UK, Worldwide Fund for Nature, the Seychelles Island Foundation, Queensland Department of Environment, and Landcare Australia in the design and delivery of programs supporting conservation and regenerative agriculture outcomes. Her workshops have featured on ABC Country Hour and Radio National Nights in New Zealand, and Learning from Nature was selected as a finalist in the 2016 Australian Future Agro Challenge. Wendy's got a very long list of qualifications, PhD in ecology and several other qualifications in both ecology and permaculture. She has been a land care coordinator, a catchment coordinator, organic farmer, and several other positions, including research positions. So without any further ado, I will now hand over to Dr Wendy Seabrook. Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you, Peter. I'll share the screen. Peter, thank you for the introduction, and people who are online, thank you for sharing a little bit about yourself. I mean, Peter's given me a pretty good introduction, but I think, yeah, I'd like to just sort of emphasize that the information that I'm sharing tonight has really come from a journey that started about 10 years ago. I've spent the last few decades working as a land care coordinator, catchment coordinator, and it was a sort of desire to get more involved with sort of applying. I was involved in ecological research, and but what I was frustrated with was how little of it was actually applied in the field, and wanting to get some good stuff happening across our agricultural landscape. And, you know, I look back now, and to be honest, I sort of think, how did I spend so long sort of focused on sustainable agriculture? Because when I moved up to here, I'm based in Cooktown, which is north of Cairns. It's a wet, dry tropics. I decided that I wanted to bring in and explore ways of bringing in my background in ecology more into the way that I was growing on my own farm. I started to pick up some of the benefits that farmers were getting from using regenerative practices. And then you start to realize, my God, we've spent all this time, basically, and me included, putting a lot of effort into sustaining soils and other aspects of our farms and gardens that actually are in need of repair. And so from that and that realization and some light bulb moments and seeing, the amazing opportunities we have now to sort of see what people are doing in various parts of the world, courtesy of platforms like YouTube and, conferences online, starting to see some of the benefits that other growers were getting, but then sort of saying, okay, this is regenerative agriculture, but how are they doing it? And coming so often back to just seeing that regenerative agriculture is a series of practices, whether it's no-till or agroforestry or cover crops. And I started to experiment with things, and I realized that I needed to know why these things worked, because in understanding why they worked, I could then apply them to my own conditions. And really, so this talk tonight, Future-Proof Your Land, Regenerating the Ecological Functions in Your Production Systems, is what has come from that journey. And the wonderful thing, so as Peter said, that this is about ecological principles. And often when we say the word principles, people go, oh my God, that sounds complicated. But the wonderful thing is that when we delve deep and look at what's underlying what we do and the reasons why things work, the story is quite straightforward. And that's what I hope to show you in this talk. And as part of the evening, we're also going to explore ways that we can apply those principles in what you do in your farms and gardens. So, faced with escalating costs and extreme weather, it feels like we are running out of options. But there is a practical solution. And, when we look at our farms, auditing our farms, and I'm talking here about, I'm going to talk a lot about, use the word production system. So, but what I want you to think about, that if you're a gardener or if you're, you've got a few acres and your goal isn't to be a commercial producer. It might be to grow things for your own families, or it might be to grow a bit extra for the farmers market, or even just to run some horses on your land. But you're still producing something. You're still doing this a whole lot of different things to produce an outcome at the end. So auditing our farms, so auditing our properties, we look generally at getting the best outcomes from looking at production costs, looking at our over costs, the money that we owe to the bank, and our non-operating costs. But like any other business, and I'm sorry, I'm using the word business in this case, we look for ways to get our production systems working better. And in principle, a production system on a farm, on a property, is no different from a production system that's producing car parts or chocolate-coated biscuits. There is raw materials that we use, what we put into the system, and then we use our labor, equipment, machinery to perform different functions to get the outcome that we're after. So we have our labor and the energy that we put in and other inputs to produce the products and services that we want at the end. So production systems on farms are really no different. As you can see here, I've just highlighted some of the raw materials. So we're looking, for example, at seeds, seedlings, weaners, grafted fruit trees, etc. The same thing, we're looking at using our labor and equipment and machinery to perform different processes to get the outcome that we want and the quality of produce that we want. The issue is that that production systems on our farms have been generally, while they've been generally maintained, there is one aspect that we haven't well maintained. And in fact, over the years, we've mostly overlooked these essential ecological components, to the extent that we've often neglected them, and they're not working as well as they can potentially do so. We've forgotten about the services, the ecological services that they naturally provide. So consequently, like any business carrying out interim repairs, our production costs increase as the underlying problems mount up. And we see this particularly in our broad acre, in our agricultural systems. We see that the costs of labor, of energy, the equipment that we need, the fertilizers, the pest controls and other inputs are going up. And when conditions are a bit challenging, there's an issue with the yields that we get and the quality of the products that we get. When we look back in a way from the future, at the moment we use the term conventional agriculture, conventional to distinguish between the synthetic chemical approach and the organic biodynamic approach. But I think people will look back from the future and say what was conventional was substituting for these free ecological services. And ecosystems and ecology can get very complex. But what I've done over the last 3 years with the research is basically identified crucial ecological components that are lacking from our production systems or are no longer in good working order in our production systems, in our gardens and farms. The first one is recycling nutrients. And so that is the soil's ability to use the organic materials that are fed into the soil, whether above the soil or in terms of roots and root exudates, which are the sugars that plants put out through their roots. It's their ability to be able to, or the soil ecosystem's ability to be able to break that organic materials down and release those nutrients in them and feed them back to the plants as and when those plants require. The other one is related to our water cycle. And, water cycles are huge, but there is a part of the small part of the water cycle, which is about the recycling and storing of water in our soil and vegetation. Capturing more solar energy, the solar panels, our plants and our leaves through photosynthesis capture solar energy. And I think people are more aware of this now, but for many, many years when I look back, the focus has always been, how can I increase production? How can I grow more? And the focus has been on nutrients. But like our plants, like us, they need solar energy as well as nutrients. And the last point is creating beneficial connections to use this energy and nutrients more efficiently. And in a way, that's functional biodiversity. And, I talk to a lot of mainstream farmers. And if you mention biodiversity, people tend to think, oh, God, we've got enough problems without the community sort of saying to us, oh, we've got to get more biodiversity in our system as well. But there's a lot of opportunities for farmers to introduce functional biodiversity that has a direct economic benefit to them. So, for example, in some areas, particularly in Europe, they're now in cropping areas, they're now putting strips across their fields with plants specifically there to provide food for the pollinators, to increase their pollination levels in their crops. Other examples about creating pest-resistant landscapes. If you're aware of things like cover crops, which is the growing of a crop, not for food, but to provide ecological support, sort of nitrogen fixing, deep-rooted, but ecological support services between the cropping cycle. And one of the examples, a really interesting example there, is where people are using plants like forage radish to capture some of the nitrogen that is in the legumes in their cover crop mix, and to make that, then slowly release that nitrogen, and so it's available for the when they plant the next crop into their system. So moving on, so we've talked about when there's an issue, when our production system is not working very well. In this case, we're looking at the fact that our ecological components are not working very well. What also can happen is that when there is an extra strain on the system, our production system, I'm sure, you know, Gabe Brown is very, I'm hoping you can hear me okay, because I've just got a sign saying internet connection unstable. Can you hear me okay? Anybody there?
Yeah, it's a little bit scratchy, but.
Okay, just let me know if there is a problem, can you? Yeah. So Gabe Brown, a very famous regenerative farmer, and if you just, you know, I put that slide up there with what are they called, those ice balls? I forgot. You know, in the hand, I forgot what it's called. My brain's hail. Thank you, Tim. You know, Gabe talks about that he took over from the ranch from his in-laws, and the soil was really degraded, and they had a whole series of years, two or 3 years, where they lost their whole crop due to hail damage. But I think, as you can read there, is that, you know, just coming to that realization that what he was trying to sustain was actually in a degraded condition. Closer to home, Tim and Karen Wright, they're in New South Wales, I think. So they're mainly graziers, and and again here, they are saying here the trouble that they had. They thought they were okay because they had, but they then realised the condition that their land was in, that they need to regenerate it. So let's have a look at some examples of farmers who are getting those ecological components in their production systems working better. And, you know, if there are gardeners in this audience, it really doesn't matter what size property you have. And it also doesn't matter, if you understand the principles, it also doesn't matter what climate you work in. I mean, I'm in the wet, dry tropics, but I do workshops and webinars for people in the UK, for example. The principles are the same. So but the interesting thing is that a lot of these farmers, when you talk to them, and some of you may be aware of Charles Massey, he talks about when he was doing his PhD on regenerative agriculture, he interviewed a whole lot of farmers, and the ones that had really sort of embraced change were the ones where the shit had hit the fan, where their backs were up against the wall and they needed to do something different. So Colin Seiss, Australian, and again, some of you may know of him. What he has done is a really interesting thing, which is called pasture cropping. And what he does is he direct seeds his cereal crop into his pasture. He uses time-controlled grazing, so mob grazing, at the change of the season, to knock back the grasses, and then with one pass direct seeds into those pastures. And now, talking to Colin quite recently, you know, one of the things that he's really enjoying experimenting with is actually growing a mixture of crops in his production system as well. So he's looking. So we're looking again from the aspect of a production system. So if we look at the savings on his inputs, and as you can read, that he's saving about $80,000 a year. And he says a lot of that is about machinery costs, because now instead of having several passes through the field with various bits of machinery, and I'm not a broadacre cropper, so I don't have, you know, a lot of experience with this, but from what he says is that he basically only needs one piece of machinery now. And you can read what the other ways he's reduced his costs on, you know, fertilizer and herbicide and insecticide use. His yields, so as he said, when he first changed to pasture cropping, his yields were lower, but until his soil health improved, but they're now similar, as he says, to high input agriculture. But the thing to remember too is that, so while his crop yields were lower, his costs were also lower. He's now running more livestock, and he's got better quality wool. And that you start to pick up with people who are adopting these regenerative approaches is that the income streams, that they gain extra income streams. And in this case, Colin is actually now selling native grass seed. So resilience, and I think this is what's lovely about these farmers who are, I suppose, some of the leading lights in the regenerative field. Part of the reason is because they've got the data, and that's really important for me. Is I want to show people the evidence that if we improve, if we regenerate, and if we bring back these ecological components, these are the economic benefits and the benefits to our soils, and you know, sort of things like our pest management programs as well that result. And you can see that his organic carbon has increased by 200%. And I'm sure I think it's well known now that, you know, that when we increase the organic carbon, the organic amount of carbon in our soil, we increase the amount of water that we can store in our soil as well. So he's also increased the diversity of native species in his pastures. And remember, those pastures are permanent pastures. So when he gets into cropping, he's not taking away those pastures. He's not taking away that diversity. It's still there. It's just underneath those fast-growing, pioneering cereal crops. And that's reflected, you know, as above ground. When we increase the diversity above ground, we also, it's reflected in the increase in diversity below ground. And one of the major savings that he has on costs is that he doesn't have to drought feed livestock. So Gabe Brown, going back to Gabe Brown, he's now diversified into a whole lot of different enterprises. He doesn't use pastured cropping, but interestingly, what he said 20 years ago is, he said, how can I mimic what is happening in the native vegetation in my region? And he's in North Dakota, and the native vegetation is prairies. So basically a single layer, or not, it's more or less a single layer, highly diverse, forbs, grasses, ecosystem, continuous growth and cover of plants, and obviously initially it would have been managed and grazed by bison. So what he's done is he's used mixed cover crops, and he's using mixed cash crops in rotation. So he's managing his system so he has living plants for as much of the year as possible. And if you get a chance to see his videos, there's a lovely shot, I think it's like -40 degrees centigrade, where he's got cows, his cattle, sorry, shoveling their noses through the snow to still eat these cover crops. And obviously livestock integration into his cropping system. And that's a really important point, which I hope I can sort of emphasize again later, is that, you know, we can get a lot of clues on what we should be doing by looking at what the architecture of the vegetation in our region, or would be naturally growing on our land, is doing. And I'll just sort of sidetrack a little bit. One of the sort of light bulb moments in my journey was across the road. I'm on red chestnut soil, which is volcanic soil. It's the farm was originally part of a dairy. It was, and then it was digested. It was used to grow peanuts. And when I bought the farm about 14 years ago, the soil was, intrinsically good, but quite honestly, very worn out. And I remember having some students, and I said, let's just go across the road to where there's still some pretty disturbed, but still the native vegetation cover, the native forest cover, rainforest, that would have been on my land. And let's have a dig and compare the soil there with the soil on my land at that time. And the soil in the rainforest was everything that I wanted. And I had been so working hard, spreading mulch, spreading compost, spreading lime, trying to get that same, the same benefits. And so it made me sort of think, how can I design my production system mimic that architecture, that layered architecture that's happening across the road? And that's sort of been my journey. And just quickly, there's another story. This story is actually on Learning from Nature has a YouTube channel, and we've done some of our own videos, but we also collate videos, so it's quite a good resource for people. But there's one video there where I think it was one of the first ones that I did, and I'm in the UK, and I go into an ancient woodland, and the boundary of ancient woodlands stays very much the same for hundreds of years, and this had never been cleared. And within 20 meters of the edge of the ancient woodland was a huge ploughed field. This is in Cambridgeshire, and in the video I show the difference between the soil in the ancient woodland and the soil in the ploughed field, and the difference is dramatic. People often say to me, oh, yes, but we can't grow food in an ancient woodland. And I just say, it's not about that. It's about looking at what's happening there that makes, what are the processes there that are making the difference? So Gabe Brown, he's done some comparisons as well. And here we can see a comparison between, and these are neighboring properties. The top property is an organic producer, and high diversity of cash crops in rotation. They're not using cover crops, so they've got bare ground for part of the year, and there's no livestock integration, but obviously no synthetic chemicals. We've got the other two producers, which are more or less the same. There's just really different in the diversity of cash crops, but again, no livestock integration, and no cover crops. But just look at the difference between the NP, the nitrogen, the potassium, and the phosphorus, and the that last column is a measure of the organic carbon in the soil. And I think you can see clearly that there's a huge difference between the Brown family's soils and the neighboring soils. And so the Gabe Brown, zero synthetics, they're not having to use fertilizers anymore. And I'll explain why in a moment. Just looking quickly at resilience, and this time in relation to drought proofing and making the most of rainfall events. Again, we can see a huge difference between the Brown family's land and the other three properties. And you can see that the Gabe Brown is getting much more value from each rainfall event. And because the higher organic matter in the soil, that means that obviously that they're also storing more of that water. And it's an interesting thing, we often have rain gauges and we talk about how much water we're getting in our rain gauge. But I think it's really important that we're also thinking about, does that actually mean that water is getting into our soil? And just quickly, they average approximately 30% higher production than the conventional growers do in their surrounding region, and they've generated a whole lot of additional income streams. Closer to home, we mentioned Tim and Karen earlier. They got into wool and beef production, and their main regenerative practice is time-controlled grazing. Now, there's all sorts of terms for this. There's, holistic plan grazing, which is, it's sort of Alan Savory's approach, and I use that on this property here, and I have seen amazing benefits from doing it. Some people would talk about cell grazing, although those tend to be fixed size paddocks. And I'm trying to think of some other terms, but time-controlled grazing is a good overall term. And it's basically about mimicking the tight mobs of grazing animals that occur in the wild. When they're surrounded by predators, they feed in dense groups. They eat everything, they shit everything, and they trample, but they move on quickly. And what people using holistic plan grazing and time-controlled grazing do is mimic that by using electric fencing. So the benefits that they're getting, I'll let you have a read of those. One of the things that Tim says is, it's listed there, is they have fed no hay for 25 to 30 years. And that's great in its own. But as he says, that means that they don't need a hay shed anymore, so they're actually saving too on infrastructure. And lastly, I wanted to just talk about the work that this couple are doing. They're not on the property anymore. You can read more about it. Soils for Life have a case study on them, and they use time-controlled grazing, but they also use silvopasture. And if you're not familiar what that is, it's about trees on farms, but it's not just trees on the edge of the margins of our paddocks or along the riparian areas. It's actually about incorporating trees within our pastures. And as they say, that they've built an anti-fragile landscape by allowing the brigalow scrub to regenerate. And it's interesting when you read their story, because it happened first off because the cost of clearing it was no longer sort of economically viable. And that's when they started to pick up that they were actually getting benefits by having some canopy cover. And this is a nice graph to sort of summarize the difference between the brigalow scrub, the cleared areas where they've got eucalypt forest, where there's 90% canopy cover, and obviously, the tree canopy cover is so dense that there's probably very little grass growing underneath. But even in the semi-evergreen vine thicket, where there's 45% canopy cover, they're still getting higher yields than they are in the cleared country. And this is something that I've also been doing at Hilltop Farm. I'm initially by mistake more than anything, is that planting out some legume trees, Albizia lebec, and then noticing that the grass during the dry season was greener under these trees. And when you went and had a look at the grass in the middle of the day, the grass growing in the full sun would be curled up and no longer photosynthesizing, so no longer capturing solar energy, whereas the grass under the trees was doing so. And we've actually done some bricks measurements, and that backs up our observations on the sugar levels in the leaves. So just to summarize, some of the benefits that those leading regenerative farmers are getting from basically getting the ecological. So they've got improved resource conversion efficiencies, which really means that for the amount of resources that they put in and the cost of those resources that they put in, they're getting a better economic benefit in terms of the yield and the quality of the products. And that's because they've got lower energy, equipment and machinery and other input costs. They're often getting higher yields and improved quality. And of course, resilience, particularly with drought proofing and in terms of pest resistant landscapes. And as we also saw too, the opportunity to develop extra income streams. So I just wanted, just to recap, so we're looking at the functions performed by functions performed by the ecological components. But what I'd like to do now is just let's delve in a little bit deeper and let's have a look at how to get one of these ecological components actually working better for us. So getting the nutrient cycling system in our soil working better again. So just to summarize, the benefits of having a functioning soil ecosystem is that we get, and I'll just sort of bring the mouse onto the screen there. Can you see them? Hopefully you see the mouse. Is that we get a soil structure supporting root growth. What's the mouse there? And we also get, you know, any system obviously gets nutrients from rainwater and dust and some from organic matter. But when we have a functioning soil ecosystem, we also get the nutrients from the mineral components in our soil. And this is a sort of a really, I think, a crucial element for us to realize is that as Elaine Ingham says, it's not that the nutrients are lacking in our soil. What is lacking is the biology and the organic matter to make those nutrients available, because they're in the minerals in our soil. And so the organic matter in the soil organisms, what they do is basically release enzymes and acids that release those nutrients from the mineral components in the soil. And we all know about mycorrhizal fungi and how plants will change the recipe, that will change the root exudates, the recipe that they put out through their roots, according to what they would like, whether they want more phosphate or more nitrogen or whatever nutrient they want, and then the mycorrhizal fungi then supplies that to them. And there's a lot more, obviously, complexity happening in the system as well. But the result is we get well-nourished plants, and we get abundant and vigorously growing plants and well-nourished people, because the plants have got all the nutrients that we need to grow healthy crops, and to give pass those nutrients on to people in the products that we sell or we grow in our gardens. So in contrast, when we have dysfunctional soil ecosystems, the soil infrastructure is inadequately maintained, we get inadequate nutrient supply to feed our plants, we get poor harvests, and our crops need chemical or biological fertilizers to produce. And I'll just let you read this comment. And I think the nice thing about this is this emphasizes that when we delve down deep enough, that the message is quite simple. We just need to give our soil ecosystem a better diet. And it almost sounds too simple, but it's everything is, as Peter says, this is all backed up by soil science, by the research. And so just so to get a functioning soil ecosystem, we need to supply an adequate food supply to our soil ecosystem. And just to break it down and delve down a little bit deeper into that, in a way, there's two sources of food. There's the above ground and below ground. So the above ground supplies of organic materials are our leaves and our stubble, the mulch that we put on the ground, or even better, the leaves and plant debris that accumulates naturally from the plant biomass that we grow. But the important thing is that organic material is recycled into the soil as organic matter. And that's where the incorporation of livestock into our system, in our grazing system, is really important. And I gather there's some permaculturists participating today. And, you know, that's really what chop and drop is all about. It's about mimicking browsing animals to chop and drop that plant material onto the soil so it can be recycled in the soil as organic matter. And then, of course, the other side of it is the below ground supplies of organic materials, the roots and root exudates. And interestingly, a lot of the science is now showing that if we want to increase soil carbon, the organic matter in our soil, we need to retain it in our soil for longer. And to do that, we need to have living plants. That most of that carbon that gets retained in our soil does not come from above ground applications of mulch, for example. It comes from roots and root exudates. And it's something I know that we all sort of comment on when you put out mulch, and then you say, where did that all disappear to? Well, it's been broken down by the soil organisms, and it's been used in the nutrient recycling. So it's been used to refeed your plants, but in effect, the soil organisms have breathed out the carbon back into the atmosphere. So simply put, to get our soil ecosystems working better, to get our nutrient recycling system working better, but also to get a better soil structure, we need to improve the supply of food to the soil ecosystem. And that means about growing more plants, growing more vegetation as much of the year as possible to give up your soil ecosystem a consistent food supply. And, you know, that makes sense in terms of maintaining the root exudate supply, maintaining the root supply, and obviously keeping that flow of organic debris on the surface of the soil, and it's the process of it breaking down and adding in and being incorporated into the soil. Producing as much biomass as we can to provide a generous start. And then lastly, a diversity. So growing plants with different root shapes, with different growth forms, enables us to provide a more diverse start. And I've just put sort of an exclamation mark, and more food outlets, because if we've got different shaped roots, we're pumping out those root exudates in more places in our soil. And just to summarize, so we've only looked at one ecological component, and that's about improving the functioning of our soil ecosystem. But as you can see here, what that also has is it provides extra benefits. So we know that we improve our soil structure. So we know that we get more, when we get a downpour, more of that initial water will infiltrate into the soil, so it will reduce the flood surge, the initial flood surge. It will also reduce, because we've got better soil structure, it will also reduce waterlogging. And we've already talked about the fact that we've got a better soil structure, we've got more organic matter in our soil, more soil carbon, we've got more water being stored in our soil, and more water infiltrating our soil. Because we've got more carbon, we've got the opportunity to sequester carbon, and I'm sure you're all aware about all of the sort of amazing opportunities that we've got from to increase the carbon in our soil. And I think what's interesting here is that, you know, while giving farmers carbon credits for carbon sequestration is important, you know, there's a benefit there a direct benefit for the farmer in terms of their production systems as well, a direct economic benefit of having carbon in their soil or more carbon in their soil. And because we've got a functioning soil ecosystem, the soil ecosystem is healthier, we get less problems with pests and diseases and pathogens in our soil, but we also get healthier plants, and so that they have more pest and disease resilience against pests and diseases. So applying the ecological principles, we have the know-how to get these crucial ecological components in our production systems functioning again. And I've just sort of summarized again what they are. We have the know-how to, by understanding the principles, we have the know-how to develop regenerative practices for our unique circumstances. We can trial techniques, we can learn and share our experiences, and we can respond constructively to emerging issues and threats. So in effect, by understanding I call it the eco-logic, understanding why we're using these regenerative practices, what we're trying to achieve, which is about getting these ecological components, getting these ecological functions happening again in our gardens and farms, we then start using regenerative practices as a source for inspiration for our ideas, rather than just recipes to follow. So what I'd like to do, I'd just like to open it to any questions so far. And then what we're going to do is we're going to move on and look at some examples, because in relation to, then we're going to sort of use those to get us thinking a little bit more from when we break out into some, we're going to divide up into groups and talk a little bit more about how we implement some of these principles in relation to soil. So any questions so far?
Yeah, well, I might start off, Wendy, if you can hear me okay.
Yeah.
So if you've been farming in a conventional way, how do you start? Because it seems like, I think that's the most difficult part to look at.
Yeah, and Peter, I think it's an interesting, it is an interesting, you know, challenge. It's one that, you know, change is a challenge, because if we keep doing what we've always done, we sort of think that we're in a secure position, it's less risky. One of the interesting things is that there are ways when we initially make those changes to design the way that we do it so that we actually reduce our costs. And you know, I was looking at some work done by Bruce Menard just recently, and he does a version of pastured cropping. And because a good example of this is people who are doing broadacre cropping. So huge amount of investment into putting that crop into the ground, financial investment. And so you want to control it as much as possible. You want to use the inputs that you think you need in order to be able to be more certain of getting that yield at the end of it to cover your costs. But what Bruce said, which I think is really true, is, and I think we can see that with the examples that we've spoken so far, is that when we start doing this, we can actually reduce the costs of what we're doing. So, so if like, for example, with Colin Seiss, he's putting in a crop into his pasture, and now he only uses one piece of machinery and doing one pass. His costs are reduced significantly. And as Bruce says, you know, that cereal crop comes up, and if it's good enough that you can harvest, then you incur the cost to harvest that crop. But if it's not good enough to harvest, then what he does is he actually uses it as an additional feed for his livestock. So because he's got the pasture, and then he's got another layer in his production system, he's got the a cereal growing up above the grassland. So I think, you know, there's some interesting things about, and there's some programs that I've seen that people are operating where they work with farmers and they say, okay, step number one, let's see how we can reduce some of your costs. And it could be, for example, I know a lot of the work that happens up here with cane farmers, that they've shown that about 60% of the fertilizers that they apply on their fields get virtually immediately washed out of their fields with the heavy rain. And so people are working and saying, well, let's reduce that fertilizer use. And that way we can reduce some of your initial costs and use that to do some regenerative practices. But I think, I mean, one of the important things, Peter, is obviously about starting in a small way first and trialing things.
And is it useful to use, say, a quality compost or a biological fertiliser to kickstart the process if you've been using a lot of chemicals and so forth?
Yeah, if you have access to those, if you have access to mulch and compost, biological fertilizers, if your soil tests say that you'd benefit from adding minerals, by all means, yes, do it. It's, in a way, it's a bit like kick-starting the regenerative process. But there's a couple of things to keep in mind, that if you put on a biological fertilizer, and a lot of that is about adding effective microbes, if the habitat isn't there for those microbes, the benefit will be short-lived. The other thing too about a compost is that, as I mentioned earlier, when we put on above ground applications of organic materials, including compost, the carbon in that material is used primarily in the nutrient recycling. So we don't get the long-term benefits of the carbon, a build-up in carbon in the soil. Using those things like compost, great, but combine it with adaptations to your production systems or your whatever scale you're growing at, to increase the growth of plants, to increase the amount of root exudates and plant biomass that you're naturally supplying to your soil ecosystem. So use that compost as an initial boost, but if you don't combine it with a changed practice, a change in the amount of vegetation that you grow and recycle in your soil, you're tied in to keep having to use those inputs. Does that answer your question?
Yep, no, I think that's good. Okay, so what we might do is I'll just ask anyone, has anyone in this little room got a question? Stuart?
Yeah, Wendy, I haven't heard you talk here about native C4 perennial grains to grow as a crop. Be much more efficient than our annual pastures and annual grain seeds.
Definitely, if you can add perennials, I mean, obviously we've only got a short time together today, so I'm working at sort of the principles, but it's, thank you for bringing that out. If we can grow perennial plants in our system, obviously that's a way of going back to that simple diagram about improving the food supply to our soil ecosystem, make it as consistent as possible. So if we're using perennials, we are maintaining that supply of roots, root eggs, organic matter into our soil for, you know, as a much longer period of time than you know, if we've got an annual plant. You know, in relation to diversity, it's a really interesting thing that when you know, in that section, when I talk about it in the handbook, I think about a third of the page is references. And it doesn't matter where you look at, what type of system that you're looking at. if we move from 1 or 2 species to sort of like 5 or 6 species, the benefits, the speed at which our production system, our soil improves, our ecosystem improves, just increases exponentially. So having biodiversity and perennials, if you can create perennials, and certainly I'm moving towards that here. I had a market garden, and it was a really high input system. And I don't usually take things out. I've taken it out, and I'm now concentrating. I'm really interested in developing perennial carbohydrate tree crops. So I'm growing lots of jackfruit, breadfruit, for example, plantain bananas, cooking bananas, those sort of things.
But down there on the Victorian volcanic plain, we've got a lot of C4 grasses, and those perennials I would like to see used rather than. We've got a lot of problems with some of the introduced perennials like phalaris.
Yeah, I don't know if you might not have a look at too. There's a lot of work that's going on looking at perennials and developing, turning annuals into perennial species. I think it's called the Land Institute that works out of the USA. So you might like to have a look at the work that they're doing.
Thank you.
And one of the things we might do in a future session is actually look at getting Colin Seiss to speak to us. So we'll look at doing that. Kay's got a question.
So my question is, can you please just have a wee chat about the significance of having a reasonably good dung beetle population within your profile?
Yeah, Kay, hello, nice to speak to you again. I think it's just part of that picture about dung beetles are an invertebrate that is helping us to incorporate that organic matter into the soil. And obviously they're great because they drag it down deep into the soil profile as well. So yeah, so just another example of when we have livestock in our system. I'm hearing an echo here. That the importance of integrating and getting that organic matter back into the soil ecosystem. So it's a great question because dung beetles are such a good example.
So can plants capture the phosphorus from the soil, the subsoil, or how do we replace the phosphorus from synthetics?
So what's interesting is that the phosphorus is often in our soil. Phosphate is in our soil, and again going back to what Elaine Ingham was saying is that it's what's lacking is the biology to make those available. And we know, for example, that there are phosphate solubilizing bacteria in the soil, in the rhizosphere. And so a plant will change the recipe of the sugars that it produces to say to that bacteria, and it probably does it to the fungus too, or mycorrhizal fungi, I'm pretty sure, but I can't guarantee that, but whatever. It's saying, I need more phosphate, can you bring it to me? And so a lot of soils, and I think that's where some of the problems is that we get a soil test done, and if it's just the standard test, it tells us what nutrients are readily available to our plants in our soil. If we go for the other test where it sort of says, they usually say it's the total amount, it then measures what nutrients are available also in the organic component in our soil, but it still doesn't measure what's in the mineral components of our soil. So I know for a fact here that we have this soil here has lots of phosphate in it, but without the biology, it's not available. And so I can spend a fortune on adding a whole lot of inputs. But what I'm more interested in is actually how can I use the plants to make that phosphate available. But it doesn't mean to say, like Peter was saying, you want to sort of add something to kickstart the system happening, by all means to do it. But there's not in relation to phosphatase, but as Christine Jones talks about, and she's Australian soil scientist, you know, she sort of says, you know, with fertilizers and things like that, if we keep applying the fertilizer as the original rate, I mean, you don't want to stop using them immediately, because you're just, you know, you've got to sort of wean yourself off. But while we keep putting nitrogen fertilizers on our soil, the plants will say, I don't need to produce those root exudates to get nitrogen and phosphate or whatever. So I won't, so we don't get that improvement in the soil as quickly. So it's a balancing thing, and she suggests sort of reducing it by 1/3 at a time. But we all have to sort of find our own way. It depends on, you know, our systems, on how much money we're putting into to grow a crop, or, you know, our scale of production.
So does anyone anywhere have any further questions for Wendy? We got one here from Stuart.
Just a quick idea on Podolinsky and biodynamics, Wendy. Have you come across that system? Because my brother lectures and operates a biodynamic veggie farm with great success, and it looks like there's a lot of parallels with what you're suggesting in terms of soil microbes.
Yeah, and I've actually lived on and done biodynamic treatments, and I think biodynamics is really interesting, because you've got that whole side of it that scientists, in a way, you know, the energy side that can't be measured. I think the interesting thing is, how can we actually get our ecosystems functioning better so we don't need to rely on these inputs? So we can use them to kickstart, but we can actually get that so that the ecosystem is providing these free ecological services for us. It's about saying, how can we design our production systems? How can we modify them so that we're not so reliant on substituting for these free ecological services with inputs? And Peter, you know, I wouldn't, if we have time, I've got just a few couple of slides that I wouldn't mind sharing with people, just to give people a little bit some more ideas about how they might be able to sort of modify what they're doing. I don't know if it would take about 5 minutes. Have we got time to do that?
Yeah, absolutely, Wendy, that'd be great.
Okay, all right, well, I'll move on with that. So when we were going to do the breakout rooms, we were going to look at how we can modify our gardens and farms, our production systems, to improve the food supply to our soil ecosystem. So how can we get it so that we are providing our soil with everything that it needs from the plants that we grow in our production system? So grazing practices, well, we've talked about time-controlled grazing and how that's important to incorporate the organic matter in our soil. So growing forage crops and grains increases the amount of plant biomass that we're growing, and therefore also the amount of plant biomass that's been recycled in our soil. Silvopasture, I mentioned that earlier. You know, this is I think, you know, something that we're totally underusing. There's a whole argument that the only way that we're going to feed the world is with industrial agriculture. There is one really simple solution. We just need to grow up. Farmers need to grow up, need to start exploring using the vertical space more on their production systems. And this is just an example of one of the systems from, you know, in the Mediterranean climate it's a very traditional old system. But just to give you an example, a silvopasture system in the UK where often farmers will say to me, oh yeah, but we can't plant trees in our production systems, we don't have enough light in a temperate climate. But you just adjust the width, you just make sure the rows are running north-south, you look at the canopy cover that your trees are going to produce. This picture here is from Africa, it's from the Sahara, which is the belt on the southern part of the Sahara Desert. That is maize that is growing underneath a legume tree. And the locals there call it, they call it a fertilizer tree, but they acknowledge that they're getting more than just a bag of fertilizer from the equivalent, you know, replacement to a bag of fertilizer. Their grazing rates, they're getting higher yields for their grazing and higher yields from their cropping system by having an extra layer of trees within their production systems. And here's an example. This is that same tree, and it's compared in maize yields where there is a canopy of those trees and where there isn't a canopy of those trees. In most of areas, sunlight is not lacking. We can get so many benefits by just bringing trees back into another extra layer into our production systems. Horticulture, get some ground covers coming, interplant shrubs and small trees, make them ecological, use ecological supports plants, use legumes, but also use maybe potentially crop plants. And then, which is grow open canopied trees above your main crop. And that's something that we're using a lot up here. I've got bananas. I'm getting sunburn damage to fruit. I don't know whether you're starting to get that down here. A neighbor and a good friend of mine, he's a commercial organic dragon fruit grower. He's doing the same things. And I know that, some of you may be involved or in your area that there's some vineyards. And I actually tried to find a photo of where people might have been putting trees and planting it to not just reduce sunburn, but actually to reduce water loss, to reduce temperatures in vineyards. And I came across this and I thought, well, there's an interesting outside the square bit of thinking. And that's it. If you want some more resources, as I say, there's the Learning from Nature YouTube channel. There's some of our own videos, but more importantly, what I've done is collated videos that we've tried to sort of be a sorting house of really good quality information and inspiring stories, and put it into one place for you as a resource. Thank you.
Wendy, we had a question come in from online, asking if you could touch on water cycling, water flow management, use across pasture and swales.
One of the things that we overlook, one of the simplest things we can do to drought-proof our farms is about increasing the water infiltration and storage in our soil. And so I think that when we're looking at drought-proofing, that should be like, that's the first thing that we look at. And then we've got, tools like keyline, like natural sequence farming, like permaculture swales, that are earthworks that can help as well. But they cost. They certainly do. I mean, natural sequence farming. Peter Andrews is very much talks about that it should be incorporated with efforts to actually increase the growth of plants as well.
Very good. Yes, that's a good point to finish on. A big thank you to Tim for, we've had some challenges here tonight, and Tim's done a lot of the work in the lead up to this. So yeah, once again, thank you very much. Wendy, thank you for everyone for coming along.